legend of the cursed sword known as the Silver Crow, the sword of the goddess of time, was a true story that had taken place in a world far, far away from the current one. The first of these weapons, a sword made with the blood of the goddess herself, had been used by the evil goddess Nakshatra to curse the land of Elfredin. But even so, it had been unable to steal her heart away. When she was captured and killed, her body had been carried away by a young man, the hero, and buried in the forest of the Southern Lands. As for the rest, there were countless different stories, but the most popular version claimed that when the goddess's soul was sealed, it cursed the sword in the hero's hands with its time-manipulating powers, and that it had fallen into the hands of a god. So the sword in question now was the sacred weapon of a god, and the reason that the ancient race known as the dragons were worshipped as gods was because they wielded this sword, which could control time and space. It was a truly powerful weapon that would let you travel through space or time and bring your enemy's entire army to a standstill with one wave of your hand. Hadjim let out a deep sigh, his mind overwhelmed with a sense of nostalgia as he remembered that story. "What's wrong?" you asked him. "It's nothing." Hadjim shook his head, then smiled wryly at her. "It's just, I feel like I'm dreaming right now." "I feel the same way," he agreed. "I feel like I'm remembering something that happened a long, long time ago." "Yeah!" They'd both felt like this since before they'd entered the labyrinth. Hadjim was certain they'd been here before, but he couldn't quite remember how he'd come here. The two of them turned to face each other, their eyes wide with shock as they looked back on their memories. They remembered what they'd felt when they'd first set foot inside this labyrinth. They'd thought they'd been in the past, but now they were sure they'd been here before. They'd forgotten about it until now, but it seemed that was when they'd first visited this place. You and Hadjim looked at each other in surprise as they realized they were standing in the same place as they'd been then. It was impossible, but it was definitely the same location. They stared around in shock, not quite sure what to make of it. It was standing in an area surrounded by high walls. A large gate sat in the middle of the wall on their left, and a set of stairs led up to it from where they stood. To their right were two large stone pillars. One pillar had a statue of a winged woman atop it, while the other held a gilded statue of a dragon. Both had the same look of majesty as they had back then. It felt like they'd only just been here yesterday, but at the same time, it felt like it had been ages since they'd first set foot inside this labyrinth. "This is the entrance we used to come in, right?" You said slowly. "Yeah," Hadjim replied. "It feels like it's been a long time, though." "How can you tell?" You asked curiously. Hadjim shrugged. "I don't know, but I feel like we've been here before." He was convinced, but he didn't know how he knew. Hadjim began walking forward slowly. You followed after him, wondering why he hadn't said anything when they'd first met in this room. He stopped and stared at one of the large stone pillars. "So, what are we doing here again?" You asked. "It's not like we came here just to take a stroll," Hadjim said. "Then what do we do?" Hadjim paused before answering Yu's question. Yu tilted her head to the side as she watched Hadjim, wondering if he was trying to remember something. But before she could say anything, Hadjim suddenly held his sword up to the sky. The blade shimmered brightly and began glowing white. It was the same as it had been before when he'd summoned the giant monster to help them. He swung it down to point at the floor. The stone split asunder, sending sparks flying into the air. Hadjim thrust his sword into the crack he'd opened in the ground, and his blade sank in easily. "Oh," you gasped. She remembered what had happened. She'd been shocked at first when he pulled out his sword and swung it down, but when the sparks flew into the air and the ground broke, she'd understood what he was trying to do. The two of them had been standing in front of an entrance to the labyrinth when Hadjim had summoned the monster to help them. They'd gone in and defeated all of the monsters inside, but they'd forgotten how to get out. After that, they'd found a large hole in the ground and decided to investigate. And that's exactly what they'd done here, too. "Now we can get out," Hadjim said happily. "You sure? The last time I went in, I couldn't find my way out," you said. She recalled how frustrated she'd been then. "There are no more monsters inside now," Hadjim reassured her. "I doubt they'll come back now." "Okay then, let's go." You nodded. She could see the gate that she remembered standing right in front of them now, and it was still open. It had been shut tight when she'd gone in last time. She started to walk toward it. "Wait, hold on." Hadjim called out to her as she was about to step through it. "What?" you asked, glancing over at him curiously. "Just give me a second, okay? We might as well be careful." Hadjim was still holding his sword up to the sky as he said that, so you could guess what he was planning. He'd used this trick before to open the gate without touching the entrance. He pointed his sword toward the ground right in front of them and swung it down hard. The ground cracked and crumbled. I'm not sure if I should be worried or impressed, you said as she looked down at the hole Hadjime had opened in the ground. Hadjime waved his hands dismissively at her before jumping into the hole you had created. You jumped into it too and found herself falling into darkness. She could see nothing but darkness in any direction as her body fell deeper and deeper into the hole Hadjime had opened. You panicked slightly before remembering what Hadjime had told her. I'm not sure if I should be worried or impressed. She repeated his words from before and let out a breath of relief. Hadjime was right. There were no monsters around, so there shouldn't be any need to worry. He'd done that on purpose so they could safely explore this labyrinth and look for whatever it was he wanted to find here. That's why you relaxed and let herself float down into the darkness below her. She landed softly and began walking forward. She felt around for a switch or a lever that would open the door above her, but she couldn't find anything like that. She began walking along the passageway until she came to an intersection. She tried one of the passageways but found it ended at a dead end. She tried another one, only to find that one too led to a dead end as well. It's pretty hard to find a way out when you don't know where you're going, she said after a moment, finding that frustrating. But you had expected this. That was why she decided not to go down this path in the first place. Instead, she tried another one and eventually found herself back at the door Hadjime had opened earlier. Guess this means we should keep going this way. You took a look back and saw Hadjime floating down through the darkness after her. I'll lead the way, so just follow behind me. Sure, Hadjime said with a nod as he floated down behind you. He felt around for a switch or lever or anything that looked like it would open the door up above them, but found nothing. He sighed as he realized he'd have to take out his sword and cut them both free again. How are you finding it so far? He asked. I'm fine, you replied. She didn't want Hadjime to cut the door free just yet though. Are you sure we'll be able to get out? She asked. Of course, Hadjime said as he glanced at her with a grin on his face. He hadn't told her anything because he wanted to make her more curious than she already was. We'll be able to find our way out sooner or later, he said reassuringly. I know. You smiled back at him before continuing to follow after him as he drifted through the darkness below her. It passed through several more corridors like that before finally coming to another dead end. You was getting tired and started to think it might be easier just to cut Hadjime free and let him open the door instead of wandering through these halls for hours until they found their way out again. But then she realized they could hear footsteps from somewhere above them. She looked up and could see a shadowy figure in the distance. It was moving toward them at a slow, steady pace, and from what she could tell it was humanoid in shape. That meant it wasn't a monster, which meant it might be someone who could tell her where they were and help them get out of here. She looked around for a way to signal the approaching person, but saw none. There was no wall she could bend on or anything like that either. She looked back down the hole and saw Hadjime floating in front of her, his expression blank as he looked down at the floor below him. Then she noticed he had his sword in his hand and was holding it up to the ceiling with both hands above his head. He wasn't making any motion, but she could see it glowing white in the darkness. She guessed he was trying to call the monster to them again, but hadn't given up yet on finding a way out on his own. She put a hand on his shoulder to stop him, and Hadjime's eyes shot open wide as he realized he hadn't been paying attention to what was happening behind him. He looked over his shoulder and saw a shadowy figure standing there, staring down at him. The figure slowly raised one hand, palm up toward him. You saw his body tense up and realized it must have been some sort of signal to the other person. She quickly grabbed his arm and shook her head. Hadjime understood that meant no and lowered his sword back to his side. You could see him trying to calm himself down as well as he floated back up to his original position in front of you. He stopped when he was directly in front of her and stared back into her eyes. He knew he was still scared, but he didn't want her to show it on her face. She must have understood that because she smiled and nodded at him reassuringly, then looked back at the figure. You could see it was a young girl now. She looked to be about Hadjime's age or maybe slightly older than that. Her hair was long and silky white, but her eyes were dark crimson. She was wearing a flowing robe that came down to her feet, and a deep crimson cloak hung from her shoulders, trailing behind her like a cape as she floated toward them. Her feet didn't seem to touch the ground, and you had no idea how she was staying upright. She wasn't wearing any shoes either, which made sense if her feet were simply floating through the air. She wore white gloves on each of her hands, and 2 golden rings adorned her fingers. The girl stopped just in front of Hadjime and you, and reached out toward them with one hand. Hadjime instinctively grabbed her wrist and pulled her closer. I'm sorry about this. He apologized, but could you please tell us where we are? Of course, she said with a gentle smile. She turned her gaze away from him and looked up at the ceiling. She seemed to be searching for something before she turned her gaze back to them and said, This is the final room of the labyrinth.